Welcome, everybody. Good morning. I'm Sarah Green Carmichael from Bloomberg Opinion, and I'm here today with our tech columnists, Parmi Olson and Dave Lee. Today, we are talking about Musk, Zuckerberg, and tech under Trump's second term in office. In his first term as president, big tech companies often didn't go along with what he wanted. After the January 6th attack on the Capitol, he was deplatformed by Facebook and Twitter. Of course, things have changed now that he prepares to take office for a second time. Twitter is now X. Its owner, Elon Musk, invested $200 million in getting Trump elected again. Mark Zuckerberg has just visited Mar-a-Lago to congratulate Trump in his victory. And all of this is happening at a time when lawmakers are considering sweeping new rules for the industry, from a ban on TikTok to new regulations for AI. So let's just start by, I think, discussing this sort of evolution we've seen since 2016. And Dave, let's start with you. How have you seen tech's relationship with Trump change over time?
Yeah, I mean, evolution is kind of an understatement, isn't it? I mean, it's been a complete 180, really. So I lived in San Francisco at the time of Trump's first win, and you remember the travel ban, as it was referred to, and that was something that really affected tech companies quite severely, because they had top engineers that had left the country for a trip or whatever, couldn't get back in. And what we saw was an incredible scene of protesters at the airport, and even tech leaders like Larry Page from Google had gone to the airport to protest what Trump was doing. And there were blog posts written, and there was a blog post from Sam Altman, who's obviously now much more famous as the co-founder of OpenAI, saying how much they despise these policies and that it wasn't democratic and it wasn't American. And the anger and hatred towards Trump was pretty strong, and it was matched by a sort of rank and file opposition as well. And you found many of the leaders at these companies were under pressure from within to make strong statements and to sort of reassure their staff that they weren't going to be put to work doing things for the Trump administration. So we saw organizations. There was an organization called No Tech for ICE, and so this was a bunch of tech workers who said, well, we're not going to use our talents to build software that could help with deportations or any other kind of immigration enforcement. That was then. Now it's very, very different. We're not seeing those protest groups. I checked in with many of the people who were protesting last time. They were saying the environment just isn't there now to do that. Firstly, the people who work at these companies, they don't all think the same way, and perhaps as much as they used to before. And so there's a lot of disenfranchised workers when it comes to how they think about the Democrats, which is one thing. And also, the world has changed considerably. I think, one of the big sticking points between tech and the government was around warfare and military uses of tech. But that was at a time when the wars were Iraq and Afghanistan. And what's happened since then, of course, is that we've got the wars in Ukraine and the conflict in Gaza. And there's obviously a very different sentiment around those conflicts. So I think that it's not just Trump coming back, but it's a different world that we're in now. And so we're not going to see the same level of resistance from Silicon Valley to these policies. At the same time, there's also a great need from Silicon Valley for help with the next stage of their evolution. You have a company, well, pretty much all the tech companies building AI, and someone like Sam Altman, who I just mentioned, he needs the government to pave the way for data centers, for power plants, for better or regulations that are going to be favorable to them building AI models in a way that perhaps the Biden a new or a Harris administration may not have been. So he's welcome in Silicon Valley in a way that he just wasn't in 2016, should I say.
Mm-hmm. I think there's also been a little bit of a cultural backlash in Silicon Valley, particularly among some of the tech leaders. It's there, and I think it's actually potentially a reaction to what's also been known as the techlash. So, when you think about how the media and the press reported on technology, maybe 15 years ago, it was very much like a Google and Facebook are connecting the world, organizing the world's information. This is all great. And then you had Cambridge Analytica, these milestones in the history of these companies where people started to just become a little bit more skeptical about the true intentions of the founders and the growth at all costs, profit maximization model that these companies had. And people were starting to see the side effects of social media, mental health harms, and we have a backlash against technology. And actually, in the last 5, maybe almost 10 years, maybe the last 5 years especially, just there's been a lot more negative critical media attention on these companies and on their founders. And I think that's actually quite like, it's been hard for them to deal with, because the culture in Silicon Valley for a long time has been very much that the founder knows best. And this is something that was perpetuated by Paul Graham, who is the founder of Y Combinator, which is a very important startup accelerator in the region that just seeds a lot of the innovation and the new companies. And he's like a guru, and he kind of set in motion this idea that if you're the founder of a startup, you should really have control of the company, because you've got a long-term 10, 20-year vision and you need to see it through. And that is why Mark Zuckerberg has control of Facebook's voting shares. And there are similar structures set up for the founders of Google and Snap, because you have to trust the founder because they're a visionary and they have this vision, they need to see it through. And then all of a sudden you combine that belief with this backlash against tech. And I think that's just been something that's kind of psychologically difficult for the founders of these companies to deal with. And there's been almost this kind of reaction to that now. I see almost as this shift towards some of the ideology, is the anti-woke, the anti-DEI kind of rhetoric that we're hearing from people like Trump and those in his orbit. That might be another reason why they kind of are gravitating more in that direction.
I think that's particularly the case with the sort of the VC class in Silicon Valley. You had Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz. He tweeted basically what you were just saying. He said things, and I'll try and find it in a moment. But he said something along the lines of, we try to do good things for people. We made these wonderful tools, and all we got was tax. And there's this feeling.
Oh,
and I remember a call a number of years ago I had with a Silicon Valley VC, and it was off the record, which is good because I can't actually remember who it was now. But they were saying, we feel like we're the new bankers, right? The sort of like post-financial crisis, the anger towards bank bonuses and that class. There was a point in time, and it was like, say, after Cambridge Analytica, where the whole tone changed, and all of a sudden these Silicon Valley figures were hated by a lot of people, and they were, and I think the press was the tone of tech coverage changed. The type of people who did tech coverage changed for the better, in terms of, they were coming at it with more diverse perspectives, as opposed to, oh, isn't tech cool and exciting? That was certainly a lesson for me as a tech reporter. I had sort of completely shifted how I sort of cover these companies. But I think the people involved in building those companies hated it. They were furious, and they felt underappreciated. They felt attacked. And this is partly a rebellion around that sentiment, I think, which is, I think maybe they've got thin skin to be doing it in this way, but, that's certainly, there is a considerable number of people that do feel that's what's happened.
But you can kind of understand why Mark Andreessen would say that, because like a big part of the culture there in Silicon Valley as well, when you're building a company, is to have a mission. And it's almost become cliche that when you start a company, that you're doing it to make the world a better place. The TV series Silicon Valley had a great montage just completely making fun of that. But a lot of startups really do see themselves as having this very positive social impact, to the point they almost frame themselves as altruistic in what they're doing. Look at OpenAI. They sort of positive, you could almost taken it to the extreme. We're building AI for the benefit of humanity. They're starting off as a nonprofit. But of course, principles in Silicon Valley will turn on a dime in much the same way their political ideology will. So, OpenAI is now becoming a for-profit organization. And it's looking, as Dave has written, they're looking at maybe getting an ad model going, an ad business going. So, when you look at some of the people refer to this as mission drift in the tech industry. So these shifts, the tech industry is very cyclical, not just in terms of the economic circumstances, but also in terms of the beliefs.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think that you are both right, that there is something of a cultural shift here, and that backlash definitely has perhaps drawn some tech leaders and investors sort of personally towards Trump. I also think there may be just some self-interest here in terms of they
Yeah.
want a regulatory environment that's good for their companies. And I feel like the place to drill down on that first is with Elon Musk, who has just become ubiquitous on Trump's campaign and now during the transition. Some have almost called him like a shadow vice president. He's sitting in on calls with world leaders. He invested that $200 million in getting Trump reelected. And I use the word invested on purpose. It wasn't a gift. It comes with strings. At one point on the campaign, Trump said, I didn't used to like EVs, but now Elon is donating to me. So I have to like them. Like he just was it was very obviously a transaction. So I thought we should drill down a little bit into Elon Musk, his conflicts of interest, and what he might actually be hoping to get out of this relationship.
I mean, for Musk, it's interesting because it wasn't that long ago that Musk was saying that Trump was unfit to do the job. He was backing Ron DeSantis, then he was backing RFK Jr., I believe, for a shot. All these sort of different permutations of Elon Musk's support have bounced around. The constant in this, and to your point as well, Sarah, about this is good for business. The constant is what is good for business and what's going to be the path for my company's been as successful as possible. And a lot of these other values that Musk talks about as well are kind of almost on top of the core value, which is business success. For Musk, Tesla is in what I think is a pretty precarious position going into 2025, because in the last year they've abandoned the idea of building a affordable EV, which had been when Musk wrote his master plan, as he called it, for how he was going to make Tesla into the biggest car company in the world. It began by making an expensive EV, and then he'd make a cheap one with the money he made from the expensive one. And then it was world domination, and investors loved that idea, and that's why Tesla was able to grow as quickly and raise as much money as it did, and so forth. But then he abandoned that, and instead he's gone all in on robo-taxis, and the idea that Tesla can run this self-driving fleet all over the world using the hardware that's in the cars already, and people will rent out their cars, and people would be driving in the back seat without a driver and that sort of stuff. But the difference between that vision and reality is enormous, and regulatory the environment isn't there. To do self-driving cars is very, very strict. The Tesla cars aren't legal to be self-driven. He's done 0 miles in self-driving on public roads in the US, and in order to meet the expectation he set for investors, he needs someone to say, right, there's a new federal self-driving law, and away you go, right? And that was never going to happen under Harris. I'm skeptical it's actually going to happen under Trump. I think there's too many things that stand in the way, not least the technical limitations of the cars themselves. But this is what Musk gets out of this, right? I think he gets this sort of whisper in the ear of Trump. And if there's one thing people learned from the last Trump administration is, and you heard this from a lot of his aides that then subsequently opposed him this year, was that the last person to get in his ear often got what they wanted, right? And I think Musk, every picture I've seen of Trump since he was elected, I feel Musk has been sat there like a limpet at the table, just sort of constantly around him, to the point where you've seen reports of Trump aides saying Musk just won't go home, right? And he was there at Thanksgiving. The man's got 12 children. He spent Thanksgiving
He's a clinger.
with Donald Trump.
Yeah,
he really is. And he's I've not spent time with Elon Musk, but we know that he's got a quite interesting personality where I imagine that gets quite annoying. So what we're seeing here is him just trying to really, assert his influence. And of course, then there's this Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, which, as we know, isn't a department, but it is going to be very influential. And that's a really, talk about conflict of interest, like you were saying. That's the idea that Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are going to go around and say that's not good for money, that's not good value for money. There's obviously benefits to Elon Musk directly for being able to do that. So it's pretty unprecedented.
Clearly what will be probably considered a good benefit is any contracts that are going to SpaceX, those will be considered probably important investments, but other things, maybe not so much.
SpaceX is a strange thing because I feel like he'd have got a lot of those anyway, such as the strength of SpaceX compared to any other contracts NASA's using. But yes, it certainly doesn't harm it.
Doesn't hurt. Parmi, what are your thoughts on sort of what Mark Zuckerberg might be hoping to get out of this relationship? He was just down at Mar-a-Lago kind of chatting with Trump, apparently sort of conceded that, probably something Trump wanted to hear, that they went overboard with moderation. What are your thoughts on kind of how that relationship has evolved and where Zuckerberg would like to see it go next?
Well, I think it's really interesting to have seen just the change, that shift that we've talked about earlier, and with Mark Zuckerberg, it really seemed to his support for Trump became more public after the assassination attempt on Trump, and Mark Zuckerberg gave an interview with Bloomberg, saying something along the lines of, I think I can find it here, that when Trump raised his fist after the incident, he had the blood coming down his face. He called it one of the most badass things I've ever seen in my life. And he said, I think that's why a lot of people like the guy. It's hard not to get emotional about that spirit and that fight. So Zuckerberg was actually quite public about his admiration for Trump. And after that moment, I think it was around that time we also saw a lot more public support for Trump coming from Musk as well. So
that's right, when the endorsement came out.
That was really an inflection point, and it's so odd that was so unpredictable. It just came out of nowhere, and that just kind of shows the power of these kinds of random events and the kind of effect they can have on the course of history. You can't predict where things are going to go next. As far as what Zuckerberg wants to get out of the administration, it's quite hard to tell. I do remember, what was it, 8 to 10 years ago, when people actually were speculating whether Zuckerberg himself wanted to run for president one day. Every year, Mark gives himself a goal to do, like run 365 miles in the year or read 50 books or something like that. And then there was one year where he wanted to like visit lots of different families across the United States. And he had this whole PR team coordinating these sit down moments with just regular working class, middle class families in Wisconsin and Texas and Florida. And he would have a whole documentary crew and like a photography, like really professional photographs of him sitting down and just having one-on-ones with these regular people. And it really got people wondering, is this guy, does he want to run for president one day? And it was really, that was the big speculation, that he had these political ambitions. So who knows, that could be playing into it. If Zuckerberg kind of feels like he's done what he can, like with Facebook, he's connected the world. He's tried his thing with the metaverse. He's got the Ray-Ban smart glasses. He's doing AI now. He wants to try and build AGI. The funny thing about Mark Zuckerberg as well, he tends to jump from project to project. He doesn't stick with one thing and just stay with it for years and years. He will jump, like all the things I just described are just kind of like the next thing he jumped to and the next thing. He might just have, want to be a little bit more involved in shaping government policy. That might just be a personal ambition for him.
I think as well, Tom. So, we've had the last 2 years. You've had people like Jim Jordan in the Senate, sort of really building this case, and it's a flimsy case in my view, but a loud case around big tech censorship, all this kind of stuff. I do, and we saw Mark Zuckerberg write a letter to Jim Jordan's committee, almost sort of saying, you know what, I'm not, I almost basically apologizing for whatever misdeeds they'd kind of concocted for him. And so I think a lot of this is about Zuckerberg just getting time with Trump and going, I like you. I think you're a good guy. Knowing that that's massive for Trump, right? That's the sort of stuff that can keep your company out of his firing line, by just sort of offering some sort of perceived loyalty, whether genuine or not. And I think there's a personal benefit to Zuckerberg there as well, because it's, it wasn't too long ago that people are talking about how Zuckerberg deserves to be jailed because of the censorship of this, that, and the other, or how the Hunter Biden laptop story went that Silicon Valley was, interfering with elections and so forth. And I do think there is, if you're Mark Zuckerberg, you're thinking, well, if it means going to have lunch or dinner at Mar-a-Lago and, saying, wow, I thought it was impressive that you got up after the assassination attempt. I mean, there's a lot to be gained for Zuckerberg by doing that, before you even think about all the other benefits that might come from, like, the other Silicon Valley companies of needing AI data centers and so forth. So it feels like a pretty simple equation for me. And where I think it's different now compared to in 2016 is that I don't think Zuckerberg has to worry about the rest of his employees going, what the hell are you doing? Because we're in an era now where tech companies are laying off their workers. There's a much tighter grip on discipline on the employee base than there was before. So he can sort of go there and do these meetings without worrying that he's going to be, condemned by his own staff like he might have been before.
We're also at a very interesting. Oh, sorry. I want to ask a question about the regulatory environment here, which maybe is where you're going to go next anyway, because we're at this funny moment where there is this consideration of a TikTok ban where Trump has kind of waffled on that issue. There's also discussion of, bans on social media for children. Utah has pushed that. Australia has just pushed that. So that would affect their businesses. And then there's this new regulatory landscape for AI that we've sort of touched on about how are we going to get the energy needed to power this new technology, and what kind of things will companies be allowed to do, and should regulators take a backseat approach to that, kind of like they did with the internet, where you just see what happens? Or was that maybe a mistake and we should be, given AI's potential and peril, should we be more out front, sort of limiting it? So in terms of the regulatory, we haven't even talked about the potential for a Google breakup too. So there's all antitrust activity to consider too. So that's a lot. But Parmi, what are your thoughts on kind of the regulatory environment here and what companies might be hoping for there from a second Trump administration?
Well, I think the general kind of consensus about a Republican president is that there will be kind of more light touch regulation. But I think that's still a little bit of an open question, particularly when it comes to AI, because you have Trump, you have Elon Musk whispering in the ear of Trump and potentially having some influence on policy. And Musk is actually an AI doomer in the sense that he's been worried for a very, very long time about the existential risk to human civilization from AI if it becomes too powerful, and then it might go rogue and infiltrate our critical infrastructure, shut down our electric grids, and just destroy us all. It sounds a little bit like something out of science fiction, but this is the kind of stuff that drives. Musk is the guy that wants to take us to Mars and make us an interplanetary species. He takes this kind of stuff really seriously. And I think he genuinely is worried about these things. He's been investing money in research to try and counteract that potential future. Lots of money, millions of dollars. He gave $10 million to the Future of Life Institute, for example. He started OpenAI. He co-founded it with Sam Altman to try and counteract the effects of Google taking control of DeepMind, which was an AI lab that he thought was very far ahead. And he was worried that Google was going to control super powerful AI in the future. So he really does have this kind of ideological thrust in that direction. So I could see AI regulations, Trump said that he was going to rescind Biden's executive order on AI, which just puts in lots of safety checks for model makers, that they have to kind of get things checked by the standards bodies like NIST in the US. It's very possible he just won't do that, and he'll just keep that in place because it sort of covers the basics when it comes to AI safety. But I don't think that's enough. I mean, first of all, Congress has not passed a federal law kind of dealing with social media or tech or AI ever. It's in spite of all the bipartisan support about the potential harms of social media, the armies of lobbyists that tech companies have in Washington are so effective at just keeping any law from actually ever passing. And I could see that just continuing. So I think when it comes to regulation, expect much of the same already in AI, like what we've got with the executive order, maybe even a little bit more on the AI safety front. And maybe expect more just from individual states. You mentioned Utah. I think that's probably where we're going to see any other future kind of legislation coming on tech, on social media for kids, privacy. It's just going to be statewide. We're not going to see anything on the federal level, I don't think.
Dave, do you see anything sort of in the regulatory landscape emerging that you would like to add to that?
Well, I think the main hope of a lot of people is that deals are back on the table for Silicon Valley companies. The appointment of Biden of Lena Khan as the head of the FTC was like a real shockwave. And, she was very aggressively going after deals. She tried to stop Microsoft buying Activision Blizzard, the games company. She tried to stop Meta buying a VR fitness company. And then at the same time, the DOJ's antitrust division and these two agencies typically sort of share the responsibility and split things by company often. They were going after companies and have been successful. I mean, they won the case against Google, which is the first antitrust win against a big tech company since Microsoft. It's 20 odd years ago now. So it's been a very dramatic environment for tech under the Biden administration, and the hope is now that companies will be allowed to acquire more freely, which is, as they say, it's great for the startup ecosystem, right? Because when you're an investor in startups, you're always thinking about the exit, and the exit is either an IPO or a big tech company buys you. And the IPO market slowed down, and big tech companies weren't allowed to buy smaller companies. So they were like, "Well, where do we get our money returns now?" And then that was a troubling thing for the ecosystem. So I think there's a hope that that's going to change. Pardon me, I think you're right about there's a shifting tide in terms of what we do about social media, and the big fear I think that companies like Meta have is that how do you build a product that satisfies regulations in Utah, but also in California, and how do you make that all sort of weave together? Because we've seen when the EU introduced their sort of stricter data policies, what the companies ended up doing was saying, okay, well, we'll just do that for everyone because it's simpler. But many of these statewide laws are going to be contradictory, right? So that's going to get very, very complicated if there's no sort of federal intervention that sort of smooths over some of that, which may be, that is what the tech companies want to see happen. So I think that the expectation that it's going to be a more business-friendly environment is probably true, but I don't think it's going to solve all their problems by any stretch.
So I think there's been a term coined for this new mingling of kind of tech bros and government, a term that I find sort of catchy, which is the broligarchy. So
Yes.
I guess as you guys watch this unfolding broligarchy, what are you watching for? Is there anything you're actually hopeful about? Are there concerns you have? I would just love to sort of end here. I don't know who wants to go first, but what are you looking for next?
Let's hope the bro could it turn into a broligopoly as well? I don't know. I just hope it doesn't go in that direction. That tends to be the direction things go in. I think it's, again, whatever happens under Trump is going to be, it's so difficult to predict because anything really could happen. But you have to, well, another thing that I've heard is that there's going to be a lot of IPOs next year. So that's something that venture capitalists are kind of really hoping for, that we're starting to see interest rates go down. And so the likes of Databricks, Stripe, these are some of the big startups that could finally go public after a couple of years of having just like nobody go public. So that kind of gives them a potential outlet for that exit that they really want, which means they don't have to be so worried about the antitrust regulations and potentially being bought by a big company. So that just gives them a little bit of an outlet for that. But as far as what to expect from the broligopoly or the broligarchy, I hope it doesn't become a broligarchy. I hope this becomes an administration which listens to people from civil society as well as the startup scene, and not just the billionaires who are running the largest tech companies in the world. Of course, that is obviously wishful thinking. I can't see that happening at all. Elon Musk, along with a lot of Stephen Miller, a former advisor to Donald Trump, and certain members of the Republican Party have been launching lawsuits against misinformation groups, calling them a censorship industrial complex. So this is actually the relationship between Trump and those in his orbit and civil society is actually quite bad. I wish that wasn't the case. I would love to see that improve. But I think that's sort of what we're looking at for the next few years, probably.
And Dave, final thoughts from you on this?
Yeah, I think what's going to be interesting is I don't think all the bros are going to agree on everything, right? and I think there's going to be friction. But I mean, if you take, say, Musk and Trump, although I guess we don't think of Trump as one of the bros, but in terms of like, Musk is seen by many in Silicon Valley as this gateway to get their kind of people into government and to be doing, have an influence in government. And I think that's going to hit the other side of Trump's support when it comes to, what is the, how do you please both the fossil fuel industry and Silicon Valley on certain policies? There's going to be several different sort of needles to be threads to be needled, or whatever the phrase is. That's going to be tricky. I think the idea that Elon Musk and Trump are going to stay friends for a long time, I think, seems unlikely. So I think the fractures within the oligarchy could be really interesting to watch and potentially damaging or whatever. So that's what I think. Sort of seeing them as one entity that all thinks the same would be a mistake, and it's going to be in those differences where much of the reporting is to be done, I think.
Yeah. Thank you both for your smart commentary today. Thanks to everyone who watched, and we'll see you next time.